pulsing staccato rhythm that barely registered above the static hum of deep space. It was weak, garbled, looping in uneven intervals, like a heartbeat struggling to maintain its rhythm. Commander Dale Mercer rubbed the sleep from his eyes as he studied the console. His pulse quickened as he read the transmission logs. The signal originated from Erebus 9, a research station that had been declared lost nearly 2 decades ago. Mercer activated ship-wide comms. Bridge crew, report in. We've got something. Within minutes, the bridge was alive with movement. Lieutenant Samantha Rhodes, the ship's tactical officer, scanned the signal with a furrowed brow. "This isn't a standard distress call," she murmured. "It's not automated either. Someone, or something, is sending this manually." "Impossible," Renner, the engineer, muttered. Nothing. "And yet," Mercer said, motioning toward the pulsing waveforms on the monitor, "we're looking right at it." Dr. Nia Voss, their medical officer, frowned as she studied the station's history on her datapad. Erebus 9 was conducting xenobiological research when they went dark. No official cause of failure was logged, just a blackout. No survivors ever reported. She hesitated. But something always felt off about it. I remember reading that the recovery teams never found bodies. Silence settled over the bridge. Mercer exhaled, making the decision. "We're going in." The Orpheus loomed into position over Erebus 9, its exterior lights sweeping over the station's skeletal frame. What should have been a derelict husk wasn't. The lights were still active, casting a cold glow against the backdrop of space. Power readings flickered on the console, weak, unstable, but undeniably there. "This doesn't make sense," Rhodes muttered. "A station this old should be a frozen tomb by now." Mercer didn't respond. His focus was on the station's docking bay. Its doors were open. An invitation, deliberate or not. As the Orpheus initiated docking procedures, the hull groaned softly from the shift in pressure. Mercer barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the viewport, where the station's interior lay in eerie stillness. The docking platform was pristine, not the decayed ruin he had expected. The comms crackled. A voice, thin, barely human, filtered through the static. "Hello? Is someone there?" Rhodes stiffened. "That's a live transmission." Another burst of static, then the voice grew clearer. We saw your ship. Are you here to take us home?" The hairs on Mercer's arms rose. The voice was empty, devoid of emotion, as though it had been stripped of something vital. Rhodes keyed the comms. "Identify yourself." A pause. Then the voice replied. "Dr. Victor Lang. We thought we were alone." Dr. Voss stiffened at the name. Victor Lang was the head researcher on Erebus 9. Mercer glanced at her. "You knew him?" "Only by reputation," she murmured. "If he's alive, he should be well over 70 by now." Mercer looked back at the comms display. The voice hadn't sounded like an old man's. It had barely sounded human at all. Something was wrong. The Orpheus crew moved through the airlock with practiced efficiency, weapons holstered but within reach. The station's interior greeted them with silence, a silence so complete it pressed against the ears, making their own breath sound deafening. Lights flickered in long, sterile corridors, the overhead panels humming weakly as if struggling to stay alive. The walls were clean, too clean for an abandoned station. No dust, no signs of decay. The air smelled of antiseptic, artificial and clinical. Then they saw the first figure. A man stood at the end of the corridor, still as a statue. His face was familiar, Dr. Victor Lang. The same face from the old mission logs, but unchanged. The years hadn't touched him. "Dr. Lang?" Mercer called. The man blinked, then smiled, a smile that was just a fraction too slow, as if he had to think about how to do it. "You came," he said. Rhodes tensed. Something in his tone was wrong. Empty. Voss stepped forward. "Doctor, Lang, how are you still alive? What happened here?" Lang's expression flickered. For a moment, something else passed behind his eyes. Something calculating. "We survived," he said. "We're so glad you came." Then, from the shadows behind him, others stepped forward. Men and women in Erebus 9 uniforms. Their faces were normal. Too normal. As if they had been sculpted to look that way. Every single one of them was smiling. The unnatural stillness of Erebus 9 pressed in on them like a suffocating weight. The corridors were too clean, the air too sterile, as if the station had been frozen in time. No dust, no grime, no decay, just the humming of dim, flickering lights overhead. Dr. Victor Lang and his crew led them deeper inside, their movements oddly synchronized, their footfalls echoing too evenly. They answered questions when asked, but their responses were clipped, rehearsed, as if remembering how conversations were supposed to work, rather than experiencing them naturally. "We never lost hope," Lang said as they approached the station's control room. "We always believed someone would come." Captain Mercer glanced at Rhodes, who kept her hand near her sidearm. He could see it in her eyes. She felt it too. Something was off. The control room was pristine, the monitors still active, but large chunks of data were corrupted. Renner worked at a terminal, frowning at the readouts. "There's a lot missing," he muttered. "Whole sections of the logs just gone. But what I can see is weird." "Weird how?" Mercer asked. Renner hesitated. "There's no record of the crew dying. No emergency logs, no distress reports. Nothing about an accident or containment failure. Just blank space where that information should be." Dr. Voss stepped forward, scanning what was left of the station's medical logs. Her face paled. "These aren't normal health reports." She pointed to an entry, one of the last before the blackout. "This is genetic restructuring. Like, the station was changing the people inside it." Lang turned to her with his too smooth smile. "We had to adapt." A chill ran through Mercer. Rhodes exhaled sharply, stepping back. "Adapt to what?" Lang blinked once, slow, deliberate. "To this place, to what it gave us." Mercer looked at the others. Their faces were blank, waiting, watching. Too still, too perfect. He gritted his teeth. "All right. I want a full report on station conditions. Voss, Renner, keep digging. Rhodes, you're with me." He turned back to Lang. "I'd like to see the living quarters." Lang nodded. Of course. The corridors stretched on in identical patterns, making it difficult to tell if they had already passed the same section before. The walls felt different now. Mercer swore they weren't this smooth earlier. Lang led them to a set of quarters, identical to the others they had passed, sterile, minimalist, untouched by time. Bunks lined the walls, personal lockers still labeled with names long since forgotten. Mercer opened one at random. Inside there were clothes that looked untouched, but no personal belongings. No trinkets, no photographs, nothing that made these rooms human. "We don't need much anymore," Lang said from behind him. Mercer turned. Lang was too close now, standing directly behind him without a sound. Rhodes reached for her sidearm. "Back up." Lang tilted his head as if the request confused him. Then he mimicked the movement, shifting back in a motion too smooth, too deliberate, like a puppet following instructions. Something crawled under Mercer's skin. A sound, wet and organic, echoed down the hallway. Rhodes reacted first, weapon raised. "What the hell was that?" Lang's face didn't change. "Nothing to be concerned about?" The noise came again, a scraping sound like flesh being pulled across metal. Mercer followed the sound, pushing further into the station. Rhodes flanked him, her breath quick and shallow. Then they saw it. A door, slightly ajar. Beyond it, something shifted in the dark. Mercer hit the panel, forcing the door open. Inside was a body, or what used to be a body. It lay twisted against the floor, its features half-formed, as if it had been partially melted and reshaped. Bones jutted from flesh that hadn't quite settled into place, and its eyes were missing, replaced by glistening black pits. A gurgling breath escaped from what was left of its throat. Rhodes took a step back, horror widening her eyes. "Jesus Christ!" Lang stood behind them, watching. Mercer turned to him, fury rising. "What the hell is this?" Lang's mouth opened. Then he laughed. It wasn't a natural laugh. It started as a copy of Mercer's own voice, then became distorted, breaking apart into layers, like multiple voices all attempting to speak in unison, but failing. Rhodes fired. The shot slammed into Lang's chest, but he didn't fall. He twitched, just slightly, as if the impact had reminded him he should react. Then slowly his skin pulled itself back together, sealing over the wound like wax melting back into place. The others had arrived, the rest of the survivors. They didn't move like people. Their bodies twitched, limbs adjusting in unnatural ways, smiles forming in delayed, uncanny synchronization. Mercer grabbed Rhodes. "We're leaving." They ran. The hallways weren't the same anymore. The walls had changed, becoming slick, pulsing, almost organic. The station's interior was reshaping itself around them, something alive, something hungry. As they reached the airlock, Mercer turned back one last time. Lang and the others stood there, motionless, still smiling. Lang's face was beginning to change, shifting like clay beneath the skin. And then he spoke, with Mercer's voice. "You don't have to run. We can make you better." The door to the airlock slammed shut behind them, sealing Orpheus's crew inside the docking bay. The emergency lights flickered as the station shuddered, the walls around them groaning like something alive. "We need to get back to the ship," Mercer panted, glancing at Rhodes, Renner, and Dr. Voss. They were all shaken, their faces pale with shock. Rhodes was still gripping her sidearm, her knuckles white. "That wasn't Lang," she said hoarsely. It was wearing him." No one argued. They had all seen it. The way Lang's body moved wrong, the way his skin sealed itself like wax melting and reforming. The others in the station had been the same. Not people, something else. Renner cursed, working quickly at the console beside the airlock. "I'm trying to get the door open, but the systems—" A sharp shriek of metal cut him off. The walls bulged. The sterile metallic plating of the station's interior pulsed, warping outward like something was pressing against it from the other side. The walls weren't metal anymore. They were flesh. Voss took a step back, her breath coming in quick, horrified gasps. "Oh my God!" A seam split open in the corridor behind them. Not a door, not a crack in the plating. A slit of glistening tissue stretching apart as something pushed through. The thing that emerged resembled a person, but only in the vaguest sense. Its limbs were too long, too fluid, its joints bending at inconsistent angles. Its face was unfinished, eyes black and sunken, its mouth stretching wider and wider until it split too far. The skin on its body rippled, shifting between features that didn't belong together. Rhodes fired. The bullet punched through its chest, but it didn't fall. It didn't even bleed. The hole in its flesh sealed itself instantly, the tissue knitting back together like it had only been disturbed for a moment. Then it twitched and moved toward them. Renner screamed, hammering the airlock controls. "Come on! Come on!" The creature lunged. Mercer barely had time to react before he was slammed against the wall, the thing's weight crushing against him. It smelled wrong. Not of decay, not of sweat or rot, but of something sterile, unnatural. Its hands latched onto his face. Too many fingers. Too many joints. Mercer choked, struggling as its touch sent a burning, electric sensation crawling through his skin. His vision blurred. His muscles seized. He could feel something pressing into him, sinking into his flesh. Not physically, but deeper, inside his mind. A voice, his own voice, whispered in his skull. "It's okay. You don't have to fight. Just let go." No, that wasn't him. That was... A force ripped the creature away from him. Rhodes tackled it, slamming her knife into its throat. The blade went in. The thing didn't react. Instead, it turned toward her and its face changed. It copied her. Not just her face, but everything. Her eyes, her expression. The knife still embedded in its throat. It stared at her with her own horrified face. It opened its mouth. Her mouth. "Rhodes?" The voice was identical to Mercer's. Rhodes froze. That hesitation was all it needed. The thing's arms split apart, flesh unraveling into coiling, fibrous tendrils that wrapped around her throat. She gasped, the breath stolen from her lungs. Renner got the airlock open. Mercer surged forward, grabbing Rhodes and yanking her free. The creature twisted unnaturally as it tried to hold her, but its body was already changing again, molding into something new. They ran. Mercer barely registered what was happening around him. The flickering emergency lights, the distant sounds of the station reshaping itself, the wet, skittering noises in the walls. They weren't alone anymore. Figures moved in the shadows. The others, the things wearing the faces of the Erebus 9 crew, were following them. Not running, not chasing, just walking, like they already knew there was nowhere to go. Mercer pushed forward, dragging Rhodes along with him. Move, move! They reached the Orpheus, the airlock sealed behind them, cutting off the sound of the station. For a long moment, there was silence. Then Rhodes collapsed to her knees, gasping. Dr. Voss crouched beside her. "Rhodes, talk to me. Are you hurt?" Rhodes was shaking. She looked up, her eyes wide with something raw and terrified. "It was inside my head." Mercer pressed a hand to his own face, shuddering. He could still feel it, the thing's touch, the way it had started to seep into him, like it was trying to pull something out. Renner's voice broke the silence. We need to get out of here." Mercer turned to the main viewport, looking out at Erebus 9. The station wasn't a station anymore. The walls, the structure itself, had started to shift. The metal plating had softened, taking on an organic sheen, as if it was becoming something else. The entire facility was alive. A deep, gut-wrenching realization settled over him. Erebus 9 hadn't been taken over by something. It had become something. Dr. Voss was still at Rhodes' side, running a quick medical scan. Her face paled. "Mercer," she whispered. He turned. "What?" Voss held up the scanner. Her hands were trembling. "Her DNA is changing." Mercer's breath caught. Rhodes froze, her hands clutching at her arms, at her veins. They had darkened, spreading beneath her skin like black, branching roots. Then, her fingers twitched, not like a tremor, not like a reflex, like they were trying to move on their own. Rhodes stared down at them, a silent scream building in her throat. Something inside her shifted, and it smiled. Rhodes' breathing was ragged, her hands clutching at her own arms as if trying to hold herself together. But Mercer could see it. She was coming apart. The veins beneath her skin were black and branching, spreading like cracks in fragile glass. Her fingers, they weren't right anymore. They moved independently, the bones subtly rearranging, the flesh flexing in ways it shouldn't. She looked at him, her eyes wide with horror, with an understanding neither of them wanted to accept. "Mercer," she gasped, her voice warped on the last syllable, not fully hers anymore. Dr. Voss scrambled back, staring at her scanner in disbelief. "This is happening too fast. Her DNA is..." The ship trembled. A deep, resonant sound rumbled through Orpheus, not from the engines, not from the station, but from something else. Erebus 9 was alive, and it knew they were trying to leave. The walls of the docking bay twisted, the once solid metal softening, shifting. Shapes pressed from the other side, human-like, but not human at all. The remnants of the Erebus 9 crew trying to get in. Mercer turned to Renner. "Get us out of here." Now Renner was already on it. He bolted for the bridge, fingers flying across the controls. Engines roared to life, the docking clamps hissing as they released. Mercer grabbed Rhodes' shoulders. Her breath was shallow, sweat beading on her forehead. She was still fighting it. "You're still here," he told her, begged her. "Stay with me." Her body twitched beneath his grip. Something beneath her skin moved. "Mercer," she whispered, and then she screamed. Her back arched, her limbs seizing, and the bones of her left arm shifted, lengthening, rearranging. The skin tore open, not with blood, but with fibrous muscle, flexing like something new was trying to take shape. A voice, not hers, not entirely, whispered inside the cabin. "She doesn't need to fight. She can be more. We can be more." Rhodes' head snapped up, her pupils dilated into dark, hungry voids. Her breath came in erratic gasps. She was losing. Voss pulled Mercer back. "She's changing. We have to..." Rhodes suddenly threw herself away from them, slamming into the far bulkhead. She gripped her arms, her nails digging into her own flesh, her teeth clenched so hard her gums bled. "I'm still me," she choked. "I'm not..." Her jaw unhinged for a moment, the skin at the edges of her mouth stretching too far, like something underneath was testing its boundaries. Then she forced it shut, slamming the back of her head into the wall, a violent, desperate act of defiance. She was fighting. Mercer's chest ached, but he knew she wouldn't win. Not against this. The ship lurched, a warning alarm blaring through the cabin. "Something's attached to the hull." Renner's voice crackled over the intercom. Mercer ran for the viewport. What he saw sent ice down his spine. The station was unraveling. Not breaking apart, not collapsing, but peeling away, reconfiguring itself. The metal plating melted, stretching into tendrils of living tissue, reaching outward. Toward them, toward Orpheus. Something massive was trying to pull the ship back. The remnants of Erebus 9 had become one thing, one living, breathing entity. The echoes of hundreds of people, their voices, their memories, their very selves were now part of this horrific, singular intelligence. They weren't killing people. They were absorbing them, becoming them. Renner's panicked voice crackled over the speakers. "Mercer, we need to..." A sickening shriek of metal filled the ship. The hull was buckling. Mercer had no choice. He turned back to Rhodes. She was staring at him, breathing fast, waiting for him to do it. His gut twisted. "Don't," Voss whispered. But Rhodes smiled. Not in the way Lang had smiled. Not like them. Like herself. Her hand trembled as she reached for her sidearm. She pressed it against her temple. "I'm still me," she whispered, and she pulled the trigger. A deafening crack. Then, silence. Voss turned away, covering her mouth with her hand. Mercer shut his eyes for half a second. Just one. Then he turned to Renner. "Fire the engines." Renner punched it. The thrusters ignited, sending a surge of power through Orpheus. The tendrils gripped tighter, metal groaning as they fought the pull. Then Mercer made his final call. "Blow the reactor." Renner's hands froze. "What?" Mercer turned, his face carved from stone. "We set it to overload. We take this thing with us." Renner's fingers shook, but he nodded. He pressed the sequence. The warning alarms blared. Outside the viewport, the station began to pulse violently. Whatever it had become screaming without a mouth, thrashing as it realized what was happening. Then, detonation. A blinding explosion tore through the void. Mercer felt the impact. Orpheus rocked violently, the pressure waves smashing against it as Erebus 9 was obliterated. Then, nothing. Silence. Darkness. The ship drifted. The only sound left was the distant hum of life support. Mercer exhaled, his hands trembling as he pushed away from the console. His ears rang, his chest ached, but they were alive. He turned toward Voss and Renner. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Then the comms crackled. Mercer stiffened, his pulse hammered violently, because there was no one left to send transmissions. But the signal came anyway, a weak, broken voice. "Hello, is someone there?" The same looping distress signal from a station that no longer existed. Voss's breath caught. No. Mercer turned slowly toward the viewport, and in the vast emptiness of space where Erebus 9 had been, a faint glow pulsed, a shimmer of something forming again, taking shape. The signal repeated, and then, just before it cut out, he swore he heard it. A whisper, his own voice. "We survived. We're so glad you came." The first sign was the whispers. Not spoken words, but something deeper. An awareness gnawing at the edge of thought, a presence that did not belong. It started in scattered places. A man in Berlin waking in the middle of the night, gripping his temples as his own mind pulsed with foreign memories. A woman in Tokyo staring at her reflection, watching her pupils dilate and contract, as if responding to something unseen. In New York, children stopped crying in their sleep. They lay still, their eyes open, gazing at nothing. And then the dreams began. They weren't like normal dreams. They were too vivid, too intrusive, memories that didn't belong to the dreamer. Some saw vast landscapes of blackened rock beneath an alien sun, oceans that glowed in unnatural hues, skies filled with twitching constellations. Others saw bodies, human but not, their flesh translucent, their veins pulsating with something that moved of its own accord. The worst part wasn't seeing these things. It was feeling them, as though they had been there, as though they had once belonged to these places. By the time people realized something was wrong, it was already too late. The first physical symptoms were subtle, a pressure behind the ears, a dull ache that came and went. Some thought it was stress. Others blamed it on the weather. Then came the nodules, small fleshy growths that swelled beneath the skin, pulsing in time with a heartbeat that was not their own. Doctors who tried to remove them found something terrifying. The tissue was not separate from the host. It had fused. Threads of living, writhing fibers extended into the nervous system, entangling themselves with the brainstem like roots burrowing into soil. The infected did not resist. They did not scream. They sat calmly as the doctors cut into them, eyes glassy, lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile. The moment the scalpels severed the fibers, they died instantly. That was when the hospitals stopped taking patients. Governments assured the public it was nothing, a new illness, a minor contagion under control. But the truth could not be hidden. More people stopped being themselves. Their movements grew mechanical, their reactions delayed. Conversations with them became wrong, as though speaking to someone just a fraction of a second too slow. Then they began to speak in unison. A man in London walked into a police station and slit his own throat without hesitation. As he bled out on the floor, he gripped the officer's arm and whispered something, his voice layered. One human, one not. The security cameras recorded the moment his lips moved, but the words were spoken 3 seconds later, a delay that should not have been possible. A nurse in Paris snapped a patient's neck in a hospital waiting room. When asked why, she smiled and said he was leaving the pattern. By then, entire cities were infected. Those who remained untouched, at least for the moment, fled into hiding. The streets became eerily silent. The infected did not riot. They did not fight. They simply moved, a synchronized flow of bodies shifting as if guided by an unseen force. Their pupils shimmered with a distant light, as though their gaze stretched beyond the boundaries of human sight. Dr. Anton Reyes had watched it happen firsthand. His wife, Sophia, had been one of the first to change. He had noticed it in the way she held her coffee cup one morning, fingers trembling ever so slightly, her gaze lingering too long on the window as if she saw something beyond the glass. She had tried to hide it at first, but the whispers grew louder. He caught her talking to herself in their bedroom, except her voice was wrong, overlapping, speaking two words at once, one in Spanish, the other in something else. The last night he saw her, she did not blink once. When he woke up, she was standing by the bed, staring down at him and smiling. She reached for his face with hands that felt too cold. When he jerked back, the illusion broke. For a moment, he saw what was underneath her skin. Not flesh, not bone. Something shifting like threads of living tissue, winding and unwinding. He screamed. Then she was gone. The news stopped broadcasting. The governments fell silent. The infection was no longer an outbreak. It was everyone. Reyes was among the last to find shelter in the underground resistance. Men and women who had somehow remained uninfected. He did not know why they were spared. Some believed it was genetics. Others believed it was only a matter of time. Outside, the world moved to an invisible rhythm. The infected walked, gathered, stood motionless for hours as if waiting. And then, one night, they all turned toward the sky. Every single one of them, at the exact same moment. And they smiled. The body on the table wasn't human anymore. It had been, once. Reyes tried to remind himself of that. He forced himself to see the man beneath the layers of growth, beneath the veins turned black and thick, beneath the slick sheen of unnatural tissue stretching too tightly over shifting muscle. The infected man had a name once, Jonas Keene, a resistance fighter, one of their own. Now, what remained of Jonas lay still beneath the surgical lights, his chest rising and falling in shallow, deliberate rhythm. The skin along his arms had split in places, not from injury, but from something underneath, something growing, shifting like knots of rope beneath his flesh. His jaw had widened, unhinged slightly, leaving his mouth just a little too open, his lips stretched into something grotesquely close to a smile. He did not struggle. He did not blink. He did not react when Serena Holloway leaned closer, gripping the table's edge, studying him with the cold, clinical detachment of a soldier who had seen too much. "You sure he's still in there?" she asked, not looking away. Reyes didn't answer immediately. They had caught Jonas a week ago, dragging him out of the streets before the others could notice. He hadn't fought. That was the worst part. He had let them take him, his body compliant, his muscles too relaxed, like a puppet with half-cut strings. His voice had been wrong when they first tried speaking to him, layered, delayed, a chorus of something that did not belong inside a human throat. Then, 3 nights ago, he had stopped speaking entirely. He only breathed and waited. That was when Reyes knew they were running out of time. The virus was ready, at least as ready as it would ever be. They had designed it to attack the infection at its source, targeting the alien filaments that wrapped around the nervous system, severing the connection, corrupting its ability to overwrite human will. But no one had ever tested it, and the few corpses they had dissected told them one thing. Removing the parasite was not a cure, it was a death sentence. "Reyes," Serena pressed, snapping him from his thoughts. "You sure?" No, he wasn't, but they didn't have a choice. He took the syringe from the tray. The liquid inside gleamed a dull amber beneath the flickering lights. The virus was aggressive. If it worked, it would kill the infection. If it failed, he pushed the thought away. "Hold him," he muttered. Not that it was necessary. Jonas didn't flinch when they strapped his arms to the table. His chest rose and fell exactly once every 5 seconds. His pupils, dark as space, barely acknowledged the needle's approach. Reyes exhaled, placed the tip against the bulging veins on Jonas's forearm, and pressed the plunger. For a moment, nothing. Then the seizure hit. Jonas arched violently, his body jerking against the restraints, back lifting from the table. A strangled, wet sound ripped from his throat. Not quite human, not quite anything else. The veins reacted first, bulging outward, turning white-hot beneath the skin, as though something inside them was burning. Then he started screaming. Not words, not even sounds of pain. Something else screamed with him, something that came from inside. A voice layered atop his own, alien, fragmented, the sound of 2 beings tearing apart. His skin pulsed, rippled, his arms twisted against the restraints, bones snapping out of place, but not breaking, reshaping. The virus was working. It was forcing the parasite out, and it did not want to leave. His stomach convulsed, his jaw cracked wider, his lips splitting as something moved behind his teeth, pushing outward, trying to climb free. Reyes took a step back. Serena raised her gun. Jonas exploded. Not in blood, not in gore. He peeled apart. His torso split down the center, unzipping like rotten fabric, and something crawled free. A mass of shifting tissue, twisting tendrils, layers of wet, membranous flesh, spilling onto the floor with a sickening slap. It moved, quivered, spasmed like a thing in the throes of death. Reyes saw eyes, not human, dozens of them, blinking wildly like something waking up in the wrong place, in the wrong body. The parasite screamed, not through Jonas, from itself. It had been inside him, buried deep, wrapped around his spine, his lungs, his thoughts. The virus had done its job, it had forced it out. But Jonas was already gone. His head lolled to the side, eyes glassy. His lips were still parted, frozen in a silent cry. His body was empty, a husk that had been kept alive only because the parasite had used it. And now that it was out, Serena fired. The bullet tore through the writhing thing on the ground, splattering something thick and clear across the floor. It shrieked, thrashing, limbs, or were they limbs? Convulsing. Another shot. Another. Until it stopped moving. Until it stopped being. The silence that followed was suffocating. Reyes felt his knees threaten to buckle. He braced against the table, forcing himself to breathe through the stench of burnt, ruptured tissue. Serena exhaled sharply, lowering the gun. "Well," she muttered, shoving a hand through her damp hair. "Now we know." Reyes swallowed the bile rising in his throat. The virus worked. It killed the parasite, but it left nothing human behind. Jonas Keene had died the moment he was infected. Everything after that, his movements, his words, his breath, had never really been his own. There was no saving them, only destroying them. And the worst part? Somewhere in the city above, thousands more were waiting. The city was no longer a city. It was a carcass, its buildings still standing, its streets still intact, but something had hollowed it out from the inside. The windows were dark, the air was thick, and every surface bore the signs of the growth. Reyes crouched behind an abandoned taxi, his breath shallow in his throat. His fingers twitched around his rifle, but he knew it was useless against them. Not like this. Not when the city had already become them. Ahead, the infected moved, not like normal people, not anymore. They drifted through the streets in loose clusters, silent, their bodies shifting unnaturally beneath their clothes. The virus had worked. He had seen it with his own eyes, had watched the parasite burn, had watched it crawl free. But now the infection was changing. He saw one of them, a woman, or what had once been a woman, pause in the street. Her breath came in slow, measured hitches, as though testing the air. Her skin was wrong. It had taken on a glassy sheen, like something growing too smooth, too polished, its natural texture lost beneath layers of something else. She had no eyes anymore, only black slits, twitching, widening, then narrowing again in small mechanical movements. A sound, low, clicking, rose from her throat. She turned. Reyes pressed himself lower, heart hammering. The clicking spread. Others stopped, mirroring her motion, their heads tilting in eerie unison. Then, slowly, they smiled. Not because they saw him, because they felt him. The first one started walking toward the taxi, then another, and another. Their bare feet scuffed the pavement, moving as one. Reyes didn't wait. He turned and ran. The street twisted into an alleyway, and he tore through it, barely keeping his footing. He could hear them behind him, not footsteps, not the sound of pursuit, but a growing hum, a vibration in the air, as though the city itself was waking up to his presence. He burst through a rusted service door, plunging into the darkness of an abandoned warehouse. Dust kicked up beneath his boots. The air inside was thick with moisture, and worse, a scent he had come to fear. The spire's scent. He wasn't alone. Shapes moved in the dark, slow, labored breathing, a wet, organic shift of flesh against flesh. He reached for his flashlight, clicked it on, then immediately regretted it. The things in the warehouse were not infected, not anymore. They were changing. Bodies hung from the ceiling, suspended in clusters like veins or roots hanging from an enormous tree. Their limbs were bound together in fleshy knots, skin fused in grotesque coils, dripping with something thick and translucent. Some still had faces, mouths open in frozen screams, eyes wide, pupils white and burned away, as though they had seen something too vast, too incomprehensible and had never stopped seeing it. A sound. Reyes turned sharply. One of them was awake. A man, his torso still attached to the writhing mass above, twitched violently, his mouth opening and closing as though trying to speak. His chest convulsed. His voice came out in fragments. His head snapped back. His spine arched unnaturally. Something crawled beneath his skin, pressing outward, stretching the flesh tight before slithering away, deeper inside. His lips peeled back, his teeth stretching, lengthening into jagged spines. His voice changed, layered, foreign. "You should not have come." Reyes stumbled back. The thing lurched, still half attached to the ceiling, its arms twitching at the wrong angles. Its head tilted sharply, too fast, its blackened eyes locking onto him. "We were not meant to be here." A tearing sound, the body split at the stomach. Something peeled free, a slick pulsing mass crawling from the husk like an insect shedding its cocoon. Tendrils lashed outward, gripping the beams above. The body fell away, collapsing like a hollowed-out shell. Nothing left inside but glistening strands of organic matter. Reyes ran. He slammed back through the rusted door, shoving it shut behind him. The walls shook, the sound of something wet and massive shifting inside. The city was becoming them. This wasn't just an invasion, it was a metamorphosis. The parasite had started as a way to control humanity, but the virus had interfered. It had weakened the infection, but it had also forced it to evolve. The infected were not dying anymore, they were transforming. The hive mind was breaking, and something worse was emerging. Something that no longer needed human forms. Reyes reached the edge of the street, gasping for air. Serena was already there, crouched behind the rubble of an overturned truck, her rifle raised. She didn't need to ask. She could see the terror in his eyes. "Tell me we can still stop this," she muttered. Reyes swallowed. Then he turned toward the spire in the distance. The living tower stretched high above the cityscape, pulsating with the same alien flesh, its veins extending outward into the streets, weaving through buildings, wrapping around the bones of human civilization like a new, parasitic ecosystem. They had thought it was a command center. They had thought it was the heart of the infection. But now Reyes knew the truth. It wasn't controlling them. It was containing them. And something inside it was trying to break free. The spire was breathing. Reyes felt it before he saw it. An immense pulse in the air. A sensation that pressed against his skull like a second heartbeat. The closer they got, the more it sank into him, a vibration deep inside his bones. The city had become an extension of it. Veins of pulsing organic matter snaked across cracked pavement, wrapping around buildings, feeding into the core. Windows were slick with condensation, as if the structures themselves were sweating. The air reeked of something old, something rotting and alive at the same time. Serena crouched beside him behind the husk of a burned-out police car, her knuckles white against her rifle grip. "We're really doing this." Reyes swallowed hard. He looked up. The spire loomed over them, a grotesque living tower, throbbing, its surface stretched thin over something that moved underneath. The structure pulsed with a deep, slow rhythm, as if something immense inside was waiting to be born. "We have to," he said. The explosives were ready. The virus was ready. But as Reyes stared at the spire, something inside him whispered. He could feel them, the infected, the ones who had once been human. They weren't soldiers, they weren't an army, they were prisoners, and they were screaming, not with their mouths, with their minds. Reyes had thought the infection was about control, about bending humanity to an alien will. But the truth was worse. The parasites weren't masters. They were slaves. Something inside the spire, the source of the infection, the thing that had buried itself into human flesh and rewritten their minds, was not here to conquer. It was here to hide. And now, with the hive mind collapsing, it was waking up. Reyes pressed his fingers to his temple, his vision flickering with images that weren't his own, memories that did not belong to him. A planet drowning in darkness, its surface splitting open, black tendrils erupting into the sky. A civilization, not human, running, screaming, tearing at their own skin as the infection took them apart. They had tried to fight. They had tried to contain it. They had failed. And so, they had run. They had taken what remained of themselves and fled across the stars, searching for a place to bury it, to lock it away inside another species. Humanity was never the target. Humanity was the cage, and now that cage was breaking. The spire shuddered. A low seismic groan rippled through the city as something inside began to push against its walls. The ground cracked open beneath them. Serena grabbed Reyes, dragging him backward as something vast and shapeless began to emerge from the spire's base. The infected felt it first. Every single one of them, thousands, millions, turned toward the spire at once. Their bodies tensed, their mouths opening in silent agony as their skins split apart, peeling away in grotesque ribbons, their human forms discarded like empty husks. Their flesh was not theirs anymore. It belonged to something else, something that had never been meant to wake up. Reyes fumbled for the detonator. His fingers shook. He heard them in his head, pleading, begging, voices layered on top of one another, millions of souls crying out as their bodies collapsed, their minds devoured by the thing they had been hiding all along. He pressed the button. The world exploded. A shock wave tore through the air, a thunderous rupture of fire and force. The spire buckled, its pulsing walls splitting open as the explosives detonated at its core. The ground lurched beneath their feet. The infected let out one final deafening scream. Then silence. For a moment there was nothing but the flickering glow of firelight against the ruined city. Reyes exhaled, his ears ringing. The spire was collapsing, the organic mass disintegrating, breaking apart as whatever was inside it died before it could be born. It was over, or at least it should have been. But then the sky split open. A sound, not an explosion, not anything human, rippled through reality. A deep, resonant hum that did not belong in this world. The stars above shifted. The night sky moved, its constellations twisting, realigning into patterns that had never been meant for human eyes. And Reyes realized the truth. The aliens hadn't been hiding the infection here. They had been hiding from something else. And now, with the spire gone, with the lock broken, with the key shattered, it had found them. Serena was still breathing hard beside him. She followed his gaze, looking up. What is that? Reyes opened his mouth, but no words came. The stars watched back. The war was not over. It had just begun. The Icarus drifted through the eternal black, its engines humming softly as it rode the quiet current of interstellar space. The crew had settled into the monotony of their routine. Deep space research missions were long, lonely stretches of silence punctuated by brief moments of discovery. Then came the signal. It started as a whisper, a low, distorted murmur threading through the ship's comms. At first, Ryan Harlow, the pilot, assumed it was interference from the Proxima Centauri system, stellar radiation or an old satellite still sputtering out remnants of a lost transmission. But when he refined the frequency, boosting the clarity, the whisper solidified into something terrifyingly familiar. A voice. A human voice. Not what we thought. It's inside me. It's alive inside me. Please, oh God, don't let it spread. Static swallowed the words, then the message looped. The same terrified plea, the same gasping desperation. Harlow's hands clenched over the console as a cold shiver ran down his spine. "Captain," he called, his voice tight, uncertain. "You need to hear this." Captain Lorna Voss arrived within moments, her dark eyes sharp with alertness. Beside her, Dr. Vincent Kessler, the ship's chief biologist, leaned in with growing interest. He adjusted his glasses and pressed a hand against the console's display. "Replay it," Voss ordered. Harlow obeyed. The message crackled back to life. "It's not what we thought. It's inside me. It's alive inside me. Please. Oh God, don't let it spread." Again, the voice was cut off by static. Voss's face remained impassive, but Harlow saw the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers curled into her palm. She knew that voice. They all did. It belonged to Marcus Hale. 6 years ago, Hale had led an expedition to Proxima Centauri B. The mission had been deemed a failure. Radio silence had swallowed their final transmissions, and every rescue attempt had ended in nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no answers. Hale and his crew had simply vanished into the void, and yet his voice was here, echoing through the speakers of the Icarus, whispering across the vast gulf of space. "This is impossible," Kessler muttered, his fingers dancing over the console as he ran signal analysis. "If this is real, that means Hale is alive." Voss exhaled slowly, eyes flicking to the planet below. Proxima Centauri B loomed beneath them, a desolate world of black rock and howling winds. It had never been considered a candidate for life. Its thin atmosphere, lethal radiation, and extreme temperatures made survival unthinkable. Hale had gone down there years ago and was assumed dead for good reason. But the signal was coming from the surface. "We can't ignore this," Kessler said, voice heavy with restrained excitement. "If he's alive—" "If," Harlow interrupted. "It's been 6 years, Doc. Even if that's really Hale, do you think he's been sitting down there this whole time, just waiting for someone to come along?" Silence. Harlow exhaled, running a hand down his face. "Look, I don't like this. Something's wrong with this whole situation. And that message, hell, he didn't even ask for help. He just kept saying that it was inside him. What the hell does that mean?" Kessler ignored him, lost in his own thoughts. "It could be neurological damage, psychological distress, Or maybe he encountered something we weren't expecting. Either way, we need to investigate. Voss turned her gaze back to the console, considering. Harlow wasn't wrong. This situation was wrong, but so was ignoring a distress call from a fellow explorer. "Prepare for descent," she ordered. Harlow stiffened. "Captain, this isn't a debate. If there's even the slightest chance Hale is alive, we owe it to him to find out what happened." Harlow hesitated, then reluctantly turned back to the controls. "Copy that. Prepping the lander." Kessler was already moving, gathering equipment, preparing his research logs. Voss allowed herself one last glance at the planet below. Somewhere down there, Hale was waiting, and from the sound of it, he wasn't alone. The descent was rough. Proxima Centauri B's atmosphere fought against them, the lander rattling violently as it tore through thick, dust-laden winds. The planet's surface loomed below, a barren wasteland of jagged rock and shifting shadows. The onboard scanner pulsed with a rhythmic beep, locking on to the source of the signal. Marcus Hale was down there. Captain Lorna Voss gripped the armrests of her seat, her eyes locked on the view beyond the reinforced glass. The landscape was unnatural. The terrain twisted in ways that defied geological logic. Ridges curved unnaturally, some formations resembling organic structures, like massive ribs half buried in the black dust. "Landing zone in sight," Ryan Harlow announced, adjusting the thrusters. His voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his jaw. He didn't want to be here. None of them did. Beside her, Dr. Vincent Kessler murmured something under his breath, too quiet for her to hear. His gaze was fixed on the scanner, reading fluctuations in atmospheric data, his fingers twitching over his data pad. They touched down with a shudder, landing struts sinking slightly into the dust. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no movement, no signs of life. Voss unstrapped herself and stood, her stomach tightening. "All right," she said, adjusting her helmet. "We keep this quick. Find Hale, confirm his condition, and get the hell off this rock. No unnecessary detours." The air outside was unbreathable, thin, laced with chemicals that would shred human lungs. The crew sealed their suits and stepped onto the surface, their boots crunching against brittle rock. The lander's floodlights cast long, sharp shadows across the terrain. The signal led them toward a structure a few hundred meters away. It wasn't natural. The moment Voss laid eyes on it, she knew. The formation jutted from the ground like an exposed rib cage, curved, wrong. The surface was smooth but striated, too symmetrical to be pure rock. It pulsed faintly beneath their lights, the texture somewhere between metal and living tissue. "Jesus Christ," Samantha Holt muttered, gripping her rifle tighter. "What the hell is that?" Kessler's breathing was unsteady over the comms. "It's not geological." No one answered. The entrance was a gaping wound in the rock, a dark slit wide enough for them to walk through. The signal was stronger now, coming from inside. Voss hesitated. Her gut screamed at her to turn back. But Hale was in there. She gestured forward. "Move!" They stepped inside. The cavern swallowed them whole. The walls were wrong, smooth, glistening faintly in the dim light, marked with vein-like ridges that pulsed ever so slightly. The air smelled of iron and rot, even through their suit's filters. The path twisted deeper. Then they saw him. Marcus Hale sat slumped against the wall at the end of the tunnel, his suit torn, his helmet missing. He was alive, but he was not okay. His skin was too pale, stretched too thin over sharp bones. His eyes were clouded, unfocused. His lips moved, whispering something too faint to hear. Kessler rushed forward, kneeling beside him. "Hale?" The whispering stopped. Hale lifted his head slowly. His mouth twitched into a smile. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped. Voss's blood ran cold. Harlow stiffened. "What?" Then Hale convulsed. A wet, tearing sound echoed through the cavern as his spine arched violently, his body jerking. Something inside him shifted, pushing against his skin from the inside, long black veins bulging along his neck, moving as if something was crawling beneath the surface. Hale screamed. The sound was inhuman. Then his back split open. Something pushed through the torn flesh, glistening and black, writhing like a newborn thing. Hale wasn't just infected, he was changing, and it wasn't stopping. Hale screamed as his spine cracked open, splitting like the brittle shell of an insect. The sound was wet, a nauseating blend of tearing flesh and the slick squelch of something pushing its way out. The cavern walls swallowed the echoes, dampening the horror into something even worse, an oppressive, smothering silence. Then it emerged. A black appendage, glistening and organic, slid free from Hale's ruptured back, curling like a grotesque newborn. The tendrils were slick with translucent fluid, pulsing faintly with some inner rhythm, as though responding to his heartbeat. They coiled around his ribs, burrowing through the torn remains of his body. But Hale was still alive, his mouth opening and closing in soundless agony. His skin stretched too thin over shifting bones, as if his very structure was realigning, becoming something not human. Samantha Holt raised her rifle. "What the fuck is happening?" "Hale!" Kessler reached for him. A mistake. Hale's eyes snapped upward, locking onto him with something that was not recognition, not pain, something deeper, something cold and alien. Then he lunged. His hands, no, his fingers, which had lengthened into bony, serrated protrusions, shot forward and punched into Kessler's abdomen. The scientist let out a strangled gasp, his body going rigid as Hale vomited something into the open wound. A thick, writhing mass, the color of congealed blood. It slithered inside him before anyone could react, disappearing into Kessler's body like a parasite burrowing into its new host. Kessler's breath hitched, his pupils dilated into twin black voids. His entire frame convulsed violently, his limbs twitching in unnatural directions, as if something inside him was fighting for control. Harlow grabbed Holt's arm, yanking her back. "Get away from them!" But Kessler wasn't Kessler anymore. His bones shifted beneath his skin, his ribs pushing outward against the fabric of his suit. His mouth stretched too wide, his jaw unhinging with a sickening pop, as a second smaller set of teeth began to form beneath the first. His hands curled backward, fingers bending at impossible angles. And then he laughed. Not one voice, two. Kessler's own, high-pitched, strangled, and something deeper, something that wasn't human at all. "We were never meant to leave this place," he rasped. Voss staggered backward, her boots skidding on the slick cavern floor. Holt finally fired. The first shot ripped through Kessler's shoulder, but he barely reacted. The second tore a chunk from his side, revealing something beneath the skin. Something moving, shifting, rebuilding him as fast as the bullets tore through. "Go!" Voss barked, grabbing Harlow by the collar and hauling him toward the exit. Holt followed, her breath ragged with panic. Behind them, Kessler's laughter warped, distorting into something inhuman as his form expanded, his flesh splitting in jagged, uneven seams to reveal the thing growing inside him. And Marcus Hale, what was left of him, stood watching, his ruined face still twisted in a smile. They reached the cavern entrance, stumbling into the open air. The Icarus's lander was only 50 meters away. They ran, but something was moving behind them. Fast. The sound it made was wrong. A wet scraping, like bones grinding together, like something that had forgotten how to move like a human, but was learning again. Harlow reached the lander first, slamming his hand against the console, the hatch hissing open. Holt turned to cover them, only to scream as her body seized mid-motion. She staggered, her rifle clattering to the ground. "Holt!" Voss reached for her, but the engineer shook her head violently, her breath coming in ragged, choked gasps. Her hands clawed at her own suit, as if something was moving beneath it. "No!" she gasped. "No, no, no, it's inside me." Then her spine twisted violently outward, snapping through the fabric of her suit, vertebrae lengthening, curving like the growth of an exoskeleton. She turned toward Voss and Harlow, her eyes wide with horror, her pupils shrinking to pinpricks. "Run!" Then her jaw split apart, and she wasn't Holt anymore. Samantha Holt was gone. What stood in her place was something else. Her body shuddered, her limbs stretching, twisting in ways no human body should. The suit was peeling away, forced apart by the thing underneath, something not human, not Holt, not anymore. The last thing Captain Lorna Voss saw before she slammed the lander's hatch shut was Holt's face breaking apart, her skin splitting like cracked porcelain, exposing something black and glistening underneath. Then she screamed, but the sound was already warping, shifting into something that wasn't hers anymore. The door sealed. Voss stumbled backward, her breath ragged, her heart hammering like a piston about to explode. Harlow was at the controls, fingers flying over the console, his breath sharp with panic. "Straps! Now!" His voice was shaking. Voss forced herself into a seat, locking the harness across her chest, just as Harlow fired the thrusters. The lander lurched violently, the sudden acceleration crushing them back into their seats. Through the small viewport, the surface of Proxima Centauri B fell away, the monstrous landscape shrinking beneath them, the writhing horrors disappearing into the distance. But the signal was still coming through. It hadn't stopped. "It's inside me. It's alive inside me. Please, oh God, don't let it spread." Over and over. A whisper from something that used to be Marcus Hale, or maybe from all of them now. Voss clenched her jaw, forcing her gaze away from the comms panel. She couldn't think about it. Couldn't. They were almost back to the Icarus. Then something slammed against the lander. The entire craft shuddered, the metal screaming as something clawed at the hull, something fast enough, strong enough to follow them up from the surface. A thud, a crack, then a voice. Holt's voice. "Lorna, please let me in." Voss's hands tightened into fists. No, it wasn't her. It was something wearing her voice, something that had been inside her, growing, waiting. The lander shook again, something dragging itself across the hull, trying to find a way inside. "Almost there," Harlow gritted out, the sweat rolling down his temple. Then finally, a violent jolt as the lander connected to the Icarus's docking bay. The moment the locks engaged, Harlow detonated the lower thrusters, sending a burst of fire and force back toward whatever was clinging to them. There was a screech, a sound that was both human and utterly, terribly not. Then silence. Harlow didn't wait. He hit the emergency decompression switch, sealing the lander from the docking bay, blasting away anything that might have followed them inside. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "We need to check ourselves," Voss said finally, voice flat, lifeless. Harlow hesitated, then nodded. They stripped out of their suits under the harsh white light of the Icarus's medbay, scanning every inch of their bodies, searching for veins that shouldn't be there, for movement under the skin, for anything at all. Nothing. They were clean, at least as far as they could tell. Harlow exhaled, sagging against the wall. Christ. Voss didn't relax, couldn't. Her mind was still on the planet, still in that cavern, staring at Hale's broken smile, at Kessler's splitting skin, at Holt's final desperate expression before she became something else. She turned to Harlow. "We destroy the signal." He blinked at her. "What? If anyone else picks it up, they'll go looking. Just like we did." She stepped toward the main console, fingers hovering over the system's core memory bank. "We erase it. We purge the logs." Harlow hesitated. Then he nodded. Together they deleted every trace, every log, every recorded transmission. They wiped everything. The signal from Proxima Centauri B would never reach another soul. It was over, or so she thought. Hours later, as Voss sat alone in her quarters, exhaustion pressing against her skull, she rolled up her sleeve. A single, thin black vein ran along the inside of her wrist. She stared at it. It wasn't there before. Her breath caught. Slowly, carefully, she pressed 2 fingers against her skin and felt something move beneath it.